Good afternoon, everyone. I am Allison McKay, Chair of the Civil, Environmental, and Geodetic Engineering Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the CEGE CONNEXT Quarterly Lunchtime Seminar Series. This program was developed to highlight the creative and amazing research that's happening right now in our department, and we believe that the full value of this research is realized when the impact of that work is helping to inform practice and policy. So this series was developed as an opportunity for you to hear from faculty as they share their perspective on recent innovations that are relevant to practitioners. So we're happy to connect with you today and to highlight that the CEGE department continues to be a resource for you after you have graduated. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kelsea Best, an assistant professor of civil, environmental, and geodetic engineering. She is an environmental engineer who examines complex socio-environmental systems and really is looking at these through the lens of climate hazard impacts on infrastructure systems and the corresponding adaptation measures to minimize equity impacts on society. She's going to provide some highlights today and insights into issues of community isolation as a result of sea level rise in the United States. I request that you please drop questions in the chat function at any time during the presentation, and I will moderate those in the Q&A session at the end of Dr. Best's presentation. So let us all welcome Dr. Best.
Great, thank you, Allison. Let me go ahead and share my screen and see if we can get my slides up here. Okay. All right, how's that? Can you see my screen? Okay, I saw a thumbs up from Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and to have the chance to share a little bit about my work. So this is my second year as an assistant professor in the department at OSU. And today I'm going to be focusing on a subset of my work that is looking at isolation due to sea level rise in coastal communities across the United States. And we'll talk about the extent of that burden and then also implications for climate justice. So before I dive into that work, I wanted to share a little bit of high-level motivation for the research that I do. And really a lot of my research comes down to this brief quote from the latest IPCC report, which came out in 2022, looking at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change. And so this is an international report. It's a consensus report and really considered the best information that we have and the most up-to-date information that we have about climate change and its effects. So I'll just highlight this quote, which says that human-induced climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. And then importantly, what I focus on quite a bit is that across all sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected. And one of the great things about the IPCC report is it positions our confidence with each statement that's made. So we know this with a high degree of confidence. So really that concept of vulnerability, vulnerable people and systems is what I aim to address in my work. So again, high level, thinking about what myself and my lab work on. So we're looking at how does climate change interact with human well-being and infrastructure broadly? How can communities adapt to those effects of climate change? And then how can we use our knowledge from those first two research questions to help inform adaptation that can be designed and implemented in a more just and equitable way? My approach is highly interdisciplinary. So I work with engineers, of course. I also work with people in the College of Social Work, the Geography Department, the School of Natural Resources. I work with political scientists, psychologists. So really a broad range of expertise that I'm trying to integrate into my own research. I do that primarily with quantitative methods. So you'll see an example of that here. I use methods like machine learning, simulation modeling, different kinds of data analytics approaches, though increasingly I'm also starting to integrate more qualitative data and methods into my work as an additional way to gain information and understand these complex systems. And then I tie that all together with a climate justice framework. So this is a general conceptual framework that I use to motivate a lot of my work. And so I look at this as really three spheres of overlapping vulnerability to climate change and climate-related hazards. So the first sphere is just exposure to climate change. And we know in all parts of the world, including the United States, it's generally historically marginalized groups that are facing higher exposure to those effects of climate change. So, for example, in the United States, we know that racial minorities and lower income populations are more likely to live in or near flood zones. So they're facing higher exposure to those flood risks. Importantly, this is not by chance or accident. In many cases, this is due to structuralized marginalization. So things in this country like redlining, historical redlining, exclusionary zoning, and really intentional practices that have pushed certain groups into these higher exposure areas. So then our second sphere of vulnerability is looking at sociodemographic and socioeconomic vulnerability. So we know at the same time that in many cases, it's these same groups of people that also have fewer resources to respond when there is a climate-related hazard, to adapt to those hazards. So again, that can be racial minorities, low-income groups, can also be people with disabilities, people who have mobility impairment, very young people, very old people. There are multiple dimensions that we think about that vulnerability. And importantly, resources can refer to financial resources, but also things like political capital or social networks, ability to participate in decision making, and things like that. So then our third and final sphere of vulnerability here in an engineering department, we're also thinking about infrastructure access and resilience. And again, in many of these same communities, we know that there's an underinvestment in infrastructure. We know that oftentimes that infrastructure is older, maybe built to lower code standards, using lower quality materials, which means that when a climate event does occur, that infrastructure itself is more likely to incur higher damage as well. So really, I'm looking at this intersection between these three spheres. All right, so shifting gears now into the purpose of this talk, we're going to be mostly talking about sea level rise and some work that I've been doing in this area. Though I will mention that I look at other climate-related hazards such as hurricanes, extreme heat, recently a bit of wildfire work, etc. But if we're just looking at sea level rise, one very common metric that we use to assess how many people might be affected by future sea level rise is we look at properties that could be directly inundated or directly flooded as those sea levels rise. So here's one study that shows that sea level rise could inundate more than 1 million homes in the United States by the year 2100. And this is under a specific scenario of future sea level rise projection. And this study has further broken those homes that could be inundated down by state. So we see that the spatial distribution of those impacts are not evenly distributed. The vast majority of those homes are projected to be in Florida. You can see almost 1 million of those homes in Florida alone, but also a significant number of properties in New Jersey, New York, and kind of all along those coastal states. So if we look at this another way, again, kind of looking at the spatial variation in that direct inundation risk, this study also looked at specific cities. So Miami, Florida is one that I'll talk about towards the end of the talk. We know that Miami is highly susceptible to the effects of sea level rise. But we can also look at other cities such as Newport San Pedro in California, Atlantic City in New Jersey, Galveston in Texas. And importantly, the way these studies work is they really just take a map of properties, parcel level properties, and they overlay those maps of sea level rise projection, and a house that overlaps with that sea level rise is considered inundated. And then taking that a step further, that method has been used to also project the number of people that could be displaced due to sea level rise. But this is again based on that concept of properties being inundated, but then just expanding it out to how many people are occupying those households. So here is another metric of the extent of the burdens of sea level rise. We can see that potentially there could be forced displacement of millions more people. And so in this figure on my left, we see under different global sea level rise projection scenarios, one that the blue line is 1.8 meters of sea level rise by 2100. The orange line is a more moderate projected level of sea level rise, so 0.9 meters by 2100. And then we can see how that number of potentially displaced people will increase. And then again, looking at the map on the right, this is not spatially distributed equally. Again, we see Florida standing out as more people who could be displaced, but also different patches of, for example, California, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, etc. So these metrics, based on housing and inundation, are very common for researchers that are thinking about both climate-related migration and displacement, and they're also used in adaptation planning. So many adaptation policy discussions rely directly on those kinds of projections. Even adaptation at the national level, for example, New Zealand, depends on this very similar approach. And specific US states, for example, the University of Maryland, where I did my postdoctoral research. And so my colleagues and I think that this approach is reasonable. It's defensible, it's relatively straightforward, but we argue that it doesn't fully capture what those effects of sea level rise could be on communities and on infrastructure. So we know that sea level rise will impact different forms of infrastructure beyond just housing. So of course, it will affect roads and access to different locations via those roadways. It could impact schools, emergency management, the ability for an emergency service provider to reach someone and then to return to, for example, a hospital or a fire station. It'll also impact water and wastewater. So I have a colleague who's specifically thinking about the effects of sea level rise on septic systems in these coastal communities, and those are widespread effects. So the field is starting to expand to look at more types of infrastructure that could be inundated and looking at what that inundation, again, direct flooding, could mean for the provision of services. But that is much more of an emerging field. So thinking about some of those secondary effects of that flooding. And it's not always clear when the loss of, for example, access to emergency management, those secondary effects, will begin to burden communities. So to give you a specific example, as I mentioned, I did my postdoctoral studies at the University of Maryland. So these are images from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. These are from Annapolis, the capital. And in these communities, sunny day flooding is becoming increasingly common. So sunny day flooding, as you can see, this is when flooding occurs without a drop of rain. So barely a cloud in the sky, the weather's nice, but this flooding is occurring really driven by the tides, by tidal variation. And so already residents of Annapolis, Maryland are forced to adapt to this tidally driven sunny day flooding to the point that many jobs that have kind of standard shifts, shift work, the shifts have been altered rather than a 9 to 5, as we might think. They've been adjusted around the tides so that people can get to and from work when they need to. So this is a really immediate problem that people are facing, and the state is actively trying to respond to this and produce laws and guidance to address some of these challenges. So again, staying in Maryland, there are close to 4,000 miles of roadway that are projected to be inundated by 5 feet of sea level rise. And currently, the adaptation approach is to continue to elevate those impacted roadways. So it's just adding more pavement on top to these roadways that are experiencing flooding, to the point that there are places where the pavement depth is already as high as 6 feet along the eastern shore. So this really isn't a sustainable adaptation to just keep adding pavement and elevating the roadways. So, as part of this recognition that that's not a sustainable approach, there are conversations underway about actually where to divest in current infrastructure. So, where do you stop adding pavement and trying to respond and decommission or step away from that infrastructure? But importantly, there's not much known about what that loss of roadway would actually mean for residents and residents who need to get to and from critical locations. So, one measure that we're using is tied to a concept of accessibility, and accessibility as another measure of burden to communities. So, very generally, accessibility refers to the ability to get from an origin to a destination. So, this map that I'm showing here is looking at accessibility to grocery stores, and they're measuring that as areas that have access to grocery stores or do not have access to grocery stores within half a mile. So, accessibility is used broadly in fields like urban planning, transportation planning and engineering, equity literature, like this grocery store example, but it's much less of a common metric in disaster science and adaptation planning. So, accessibility is important, as you can probably imagine, because a lack of accessibility reduces economic and social opportunities. So, it disrupts the ability to get to jobs, schools, to participate in civic events and social life. It can also reduce the ability, as I mentioned, to access urgent medical care and emergency services. And further down the line, it can also make certain areas less desirable to live. So people might leave areas with lower accessibility. It could suppress property values and tax bases, et cetera. So really some of those effects can be cascading. So, motivated by all of this, my colleagues and I wanted to use this concept of accessibility to think about additional burdens related to sea level rise beyond that inundation, direct flooding that I mentioned is so commonly used. So, as I mentioned, direct flooding is a defensible and reasonable approach that has long been used as the primary risk measurement for looking at sea level rise. But we know in some cases, populations that themselves are not directly flooded could still experience negative consequences related to disruptions in accessibility to critical services. So we call this isolation, and I'll talk about how we operationalize this concept of isolation. But we're really positing this as an additional metric and a risk metric for planners, for decision makers to think about those risks of sea level rise. So, the first thing we wanted to do when we went down this research path was to just understand the extent of this potential isolation risk. So, we had three main research questions in this area. The first was just how many people are at risk of isolation compared to risk of inundation at different levels of sea level rise. And so I'll talk about how we look at different scenarios from 1 to 10 feet of global sea level rise. What is the spatial distribution of that risk of isolation? And again, how does it compare to our traditional measure of risk of inundation? And then importantly, what are the temporal differences between when we might expect isolation risk to start to pose a burden to communities versus inundation. So a bit on our methods. So for our sea level rise projections, NOAA has global sea level rise data. Again, we used 1 to 10 feet, and we were able to evaluate this at a very small spatial scale, which is a census block, which is about the size of a city block that you could imagine. This image here on the right shows how those different scenarios can diverge temporally as well. So we can look at high global sea level rise by 2100 to lower scenarios of sea level rise. And importantly, the US has a lot of tidal gauge data at specific coastal locations all along the coasts. So we can use those tidal gauges to also adjust those global sea level rise projections to a local scale, because we know that 10 feet of global sea level rise might not translate to 10 feet at a local level. So we can make those adjustments. So from there, we overlay those sea level rise projections with our current road network data. This is open access data from a source called OpenStreetMap. We look at all census blocks in the contiguous United States. And our metric that we're devising is that we consider a census block to be isolated if there is no available, meaning unflooded, road route between the centroid of that block and a fire station or a primary school. We chose fire stations to look at emergency services and primary schools as another essential service location. I do want to add that we can and are repeating this analysis for more critical locations. So things like grocery stores, hospitals, we could include, and others. So let's get into some of our results. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but the top part of this is just looking at the number of people who we might expect to be at risk of inundation with the red line versus that new metric of isolation with the blue line. And this is 0 to 3 meters of sea level rise. Trust me, that translates to our 0 to 10 feet. But this was led by colleagues in New Zealand who were using meters. And importantly, we can see that there's a pretty significant gap in just that number that's projected between the red line and the blue line. And actually, that gap can be as many as 4 million people. So if we're only looking at inundation, we might be underestimating the population at risk by as many as 4 million. If we look at the bottom part of this slide, it's showing very similar information, but now looking at those different sea level rise scenarios. So a lower scenario on the left, intermediate and high. And now we're looking at time on our x-axis. But again, in any scenario, we see that there is kind of a broadening gap between that isolated population versus the inundated population. So moving to our second research question, looking at the spatial distribution of inundation versus isolation. So this map on the left is looking at the ratio of isolation to inundation. So darker colors mean that there's much more population at risk of isolation versus inundation. So more of a gap in those metrics. And we see places emerging in the Northeast, parts of Louisiana, parts of California, and the Northwest as well. So again, not an even spatial distribution when we apply this metric. And then this figure on the right is another kind of complex one, but this is another way of looking at that gap between inundation and isolation. So we have our states ranked on the y-axis from top to bottom by the risk of inundation. So Florida, again, emerges unsurprisingly as the highest risk of that flooding. And we see then along the x-axis our isolation risk. So essentially, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but anywhere that the blue bar is past the red line means that there's more isolated population than inundated. And in some places, so Maine, for example, we see that that gap between the two metrics is especially high. And an important insight from this work is we found that timing really matters. So looking at the temporal variation here, so essentially we find that the risk of inundation could be emerging as many as 50 years after the risk of isolation actually occurs. So, what that means from a decision-making perspective and from a planning perspective is that planners might actually have much less time than they think they do to start adapting to sea level rise if they're only relying on that inundation metric. If they're looking at isolation as a measure of burden on their population, they might need to be adapting, again, as many as 50 years sooner than they originally planned. So, this has really real implications for that decision making. Okay, so that was kind of our first part of this study, and then we weren't quite satisfied. We wanted to take it a step further and ask another question, which is really then who are these populations that will be impacted by that isolation? We showed that there's a significant gap between isolation and inundation, but who are these people that might experience it? So first we wanted to know how do those risks of isolation potentially vary between racial and ethnic groups across the United States? What are other characteristics of these communities that are susceptible to isolation? So things like age, housing tenure, income. And then how do those characteristics of groups at risk of isolation differ from the characteristics of those at risk of inundation? So in other words, what are the characteristics of populations that might be left out of our decision making if we only rely on that inundation? So I'm jumping right into some of the results here, but I'll say that the method was exactly the same as the previous study. The only thing we did here is we pulled in sociodemographic data from the US American Community Survey. So this provides data on an annual basis for the entire United States. And so this first figure was a really interesting one for us. This was looking just at potential disproportionate effects of isolation on different racial groups in the United States. So what we have here on the y-axis is we have the total percent of the isolated population at different levels of sea level rise on the x-axis, split out by white, Hispanic, and Black populations. The dotted lines here are the proportion of that racial group in the overall US population. So we would expect that if the risk of isolation was evenly distributed, then our solid line, which is that isolated population, would be exactly the same as the dotted line, right? The proportion of that racial group in the isolated population would be the same as the representation in our overall population. But what we see here is actually that at lower levels of sea level rise, so up until about 5 feet or so, we have an overrepresentation of white populations, and then that relationship switches. So starting around 4 feet of sea level rise, we see Hispanic populations with this green line being overrepresented in our isolated population. And then around 5.5 feet of sea level rise, we see our Black population again, being disproportionately burdened by that isolation risk. So we dug into this a bit more. This is another way of looking at that disproportionate burden, where we looked at the number of counties that we expected to disproportionately isolate only Black populations in the red, only Hispanic populations in the green, or even both populations simultaneously in the blue. And we see that just the count of those counties, those communities, is increasing as we increase sea level rise. We also looked at how severe that disproportionate burden could be. And we found that in some places, for Black residents, they could be as much as 10 times overrepresented in the isolated population versus the base population. And that was as great as 20 times overrepresentation in some locations for Hispanic residents. So some of these places had really dramatic, disproportionate isolation risk. So again, looking at the spatial distribution, now we're showing on this map, we have places where we would expect a disproportionate burden on Hispanic populations in the orange. So we see a lot of those communities in Louisiana, again, some in California, in the Northwest, Northeast. You see really a lot of variation here. And if we look at the same map now for Black populations, we see a different spatial distribution. So fewer of these in Louisiana, still some in California along the Northeast. But this can really show us how much this metric varies from location to location. And again, we wanted to look at the timing of this because timing is going to be very important for planners and decision makers. So again, we made the same figure, but now our x-axis has the year that could occur under an intermediate and a high global scenario of sea level rise. And we see the timing really matters. So under that intermediate scenario, we really don't start to see disproportionate effects on Hispanic and Black groups until after 2100. But for that high scenario, it could be occurring much sooner, so as early as 2050 in some cases. So again, if we're looking with this equity lens, the timing really matters. All right, and I know there's a lot going on here as well, but we wanted to take more of an intersectional approach at looking at this. So we pulled in some other metrics like income and age here, and wanted to look at interactions between income, age, and race. And one thing we found here as we look at this top green line is that the communities that were expected to disproportionately isolate both Black and Hispanic residents were actually the communities that themselves were whiter, higher income, and older. So this points to even finer spatial variation in that risk, where you could have communities that they themselves are not what we would consider to be especially vulnerable. They're higher income. But within those communities, we see disproportionate effects on minorities, especially and particularly our Black and Hispanic residents. So the last finding here was again looking then at who could be missing, or really just looking at the difference between our isolated population and our inundated population. And here we ran regressions where our outcome variable was the population at risk of inundation with the orange squares there, isolation with the blue circles, and then missing was just the difference, isolation minus inundation in the green. So importantly, we found that our missing population, if we just focus on that green triangle, was statistically younger, statistically higher income, statistically whiter, so lower proportions of Black and Hispanic populations, and also higher percentages of renters. So as I just said, the missing population is potentially younger, wealthier, whiter renters. So this is something we want to dig into a little bit more because this could be a group that we think of as being potentially very mobile. So these are groups that might be more able and willing to move from places, especially as that isolation risk is emerging. So we're really interested in what this could mean for shifts in community characteristics over time. So to conclude this study, a couple insights I'll just reiterate. So we showed that inundation alone can severely underestimate the scale and the timing of burdens related to sea level rise. We showed that the impact of isolation is not equitably distributed and could exacerbate existing social inequity, especially along lines of race. So Black and Hispanic communities were shown in many cases to face disproportionately greater risk of isolation, especially at those higher levels of sea level rise. And then that missing population, the left out population, was younger, whiter, higher income, and more likely to be renters. So we have a lot we want to continue to do with this work. We feel like we're just scraping the surface. So I mentioned that we are pulling in new metrics and new critical locations that people might want to access. We're also interested in what this could mean for migration, population movement. So some people might choose to move away from places as they become isolated, but others might not, either because they want to stay, they have strong roots in a place, or they might not have the resources to be able to move even if they want to. And we're also interested, as Allison mentioned, in then thinking about how this information is relevant or not to decision makers. So we think it is, especially with the timing implications. But this figure here on the right is a framework that we're working on now to try to bring to different departments of transportation at the state level or even the local level to really guide them in thinking through what their climate related risks are to their transportation infrastructure. What are the equity implications of those risks, and how might they think about changing their transportation related activities or adjusting their transportation infrastructure to respond to those risks? So we're hoping this is something that we can roll out with decision makers. And then briefly, I just want to talk about then what are some of the potential connections between this isolation risk and housing? So thinking about interconnections between different infrastructure systems. So looking specifically at housing for a moment, because this is an area that my lab is increasingly getting into, and it's really motivated by this fact that we know that climate change is expected to increase the frequency and intensity of certain natural hazards. And at the same time, as I'm sure we all know, the United States is experiencing a housing affordability and availability crisis. So we argue that really understanding those connections between climate effects and housing availability and affordability is going to be really important. So to put that housing affordability crisis in perspective, this map here on the left, the shading is the number of hours in a minimum wage job that an individual would need to work in a week to afford a 1-bedroom fair market rent apartment. And so the places that are darker red, so Texas, Florida, California is getting there, an individual would need to work as many as 114 hours a week at that minimum wage job just to afford that 1-bedroom housing. Another way to look at this gap is in 2022, a study found that there were only 36 affordable and available rental homes across the country for every 100 extremely low income renter households. So this gap is really severe. So some work that we're doing to look at these sometimes complex interactions between climate change and housing is using a concept called climate gentrification. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the general concept of gentrification. And so I have the definition here. Neighborhood change that occurs when high income groups move into a low income area, altering the cultural and financial landscape. So really what that means is potentially displacing those lower income households and individuals away from that location. So the concept of climate gentrification is building on that. And this was originally coined by the woman who's at the top right of the screen, Paulette Richards, who is a community activist in Miami, Florida, because she was seeing this in her neighborhood. But it's looking at ways that climate change then could interact with property markets, again, potentially altering the cultural and financial landscape of different communities. So this is very much an emerging field of study, but there are a couple ways that scholars are starting to theorize that climate change could interact with gentrification. So the top one here, we could imagine that high-income households in high-risk areas, so in this diagram, right by the coast, might start to decide to move away from those high-risk areas, potentially displacing and increasing housing prices in those lower risk locations. If we look at the middle panel here, we could also imagine a scenario where our climate adaptation measures, so in this diagram, it looks like a seawall potentially, could drive up property values in areas that are protected by that resilience intervention and that investment, potentially displacing those lower income households away from that protected area. And then a third scenario that we could imagine is that we could actually see places where it's only the higher income households that can afford to stay in high risk areas because they can afford things like increasing insurance premiums. They can afford to rebuild and repair if they experience damages. So then lower income households might be forced to move away from those high risk zones. So, like I said, this is a very active area of study. We think that different scenarios here and different pathways are likely to emerge in different locations. But now I want to take us to Miami, Florida, because this is considered really ground zero for this concept of climate gentrification. So myself and this undergraduate student here, Mia Matucci, were interested in looking more at climate gentrification in Miami. And so if we look at this image on the right, this is an elevation map of the city of Miami, where lighter color areas are higher elevation. So Miami has this naturally occurring higher elevation ridge that kind of goes all along the coast. And if we overlay maps of historical redlining, where the red lines are corresponding to communities that were historically redlined, we see that in Miami, in many cases, those historically redlined areas are actually along that higher elevation ridge. So these communities that are still lower income and primarily communities of color are actually more elevated and have lower risk related to flooding and sea level rise. And I want to highlight one community in particular. This star here is a community called Little Haiti, which has gotten a lot of attention for this concept of climate gentrification. But one thing that Mia and I wanted to do is we'd been reading a lot about climate gentrification in Miami and other places. We actually wanted to go there. And so, led by Mia, we went to Miami and we conducted interviews with government officials, local community organizations, and activists, even a couple of developers and academics in Miami to try to understand how this concept really resonated with them on the ground. And so these are the results from some of those interviews. Interestingly, we found for the most part, everyone was aware of the concept of climate gentrification, I think because it has been getting quite a bit of media attention. But we found variations across those stakeholder groups and how they thought about climate gentrification and how they defined it. So most of the researchers, we like to create new concepts and new terms that we can coin. So most of our researchers thought that climate gentrification is a distinct phenomena, and it does emerge from these complex interactions between climate change and housing. Whereas all of our government representatives and most of our community organizations thought climate gentrification is an issue, and it likely is its own concept, but we're really much more worried about displacement. We're less worried about if it's climate gentrification or general gentrification. Our focus is on how communities might experience that displacement. We found then that one of our developers thought that climate gentrification is not its own issue. There's no difference between climate gentrification and traditional gentrification. And then one of our developers said that regardless, gentrification broadly is not an issue. It's just redevelopment. It's a positive. So this was really interesting for us, starting to tease out and really identifying that there was a mismatch in the ways that these different stakeholder groups were talking about climate gentrification. So let's go to Little Haiti then. As I mentioned, this is one of the communities that has gotten a lot of attention for this phenomena. So these are pictures that Mia took when we were there. So Little Haiti, as the name suggests, is culturally Haitian. It's predominantly Black, still relatively low income, but it's really this rich cultural center. So the image on the left is a community center where they have after school programs, they have beautiful art displays, they have educational resources. The image here in the middle is a bookstore that I believe is the first and only Haitian Creole bookstore in the country. We went in there and spoke to the man who owns it, who has been there for most of his life and has won numerous community awards for the contribution of his bookstore. And then on the right was some street art that I thought was interesting and highlights maybe some of the feelings about climate change. So when we spoke to people in Little Haiti specifically, and I'll give the example of the man who owns this bookstore, he told us about how recently he's had developers coming into his store almost daily offering to buy his property out from underneath him. And he's been resisting because he feels very strongly that his bookstore is an important part of the community and offers a service. But he described these developers as piranhas who are coming in. And the reason that this is happening and residents of Little Haiti have been experiencing this is because the developers have noticed, and we heard this from developers, that when the city of Miami floods, Little Haiti stays dry. And that's because it's on that higher elevation ridge. So they've started to notice those climate risks just around them and started to say, Little Haiti looks like a good place to build because of that lower risk and the fact that Little Haiti does not flood. So as a result, this is a planned development called Magic City that they actually just broke ground this year on the development of this project. This is a multi-billion-dollar investment. You can see mixed use properties, high-rise office buildings and apartments, public spaces. And this has been approved right in the heart of Little Haiti. And residents feel that part of that is because of this information that they're lower risk of flooding. So a little bit from that Magic City website. So they talk about innovation, honoring the past while building a positive foundation for the future. And importantly, they mention a neighborhood that welcomes forward-thinking change, but promotes success for all. But I will say the residents of Little Haiti are very skeptical of this idea for success for all. They're really worried about what this development will mean for gentrification, for their property taxes and their rents and their ability to stay. And so they're feeling a very immediate pressure of potentially being pushed out of their communities. So as a result, the residents of Little Haiti have been protesting that development. Here's an image from one of their protests. So you can see no to forced displacement, say no to Magic City. But I think it's just a really tangible and very immediate example of this concept of climate gentrification that we're hoping to explore more. And we're hoping to look at other contexts to see how different communities might experience this and maybe how it could manifest before something as obvious and immediate as a Magic City development. But what maybe more of a slow moving kind of gentrification could mean for communities. So I'm close to the end. My key takeaways to tie all of this together. We know that climate change is going to interact with infrastructure access in complex ways. So beyond, for example, just direct inundation. And we need to think about new metrics, new ways to look at the ways that those burdens might manifest. And a lot of my work focuses on this idea that adaptation then needs to center justice. So looking at how impacts could be disproportionately distributed, looking at questions of who's included in decision making, and recognizing historic injustices and historic marginalization to really avoid exacerbating those inequities and moving us towards a more resilient and more just community. So with that, I would love to take questions. I think maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see you all.
Thank you, Kelsey. I did receive one question that just came to me, but I will put it into the chat for everyone. And the question is, how would you need to adapt this work to assess urban isolation risk in other coastal areas, such as the Great Lakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something we've been thinking about. So we do have data. It's a little harder to project into the future, but we do have data on non-coastal flood risk across the country. And again, we don't necessarily know how that will change in the future because in some ways it's easier to take these global sea level rise projections and project them out over time. But we are interested in looking at where, for example, lake related flood risks or riverine related flood risks might overlap with those kinds of transportation networks. I think we will need to work with more climate scientists in order to think about those unique contexts and how the risk could evolve over time.
That's why I would invite others. If you wanted to drop a question in the chat, that's fine. I think today we're a little manageable group that if folks just want to use the raise hand function, you could join the discussion with any questions that you have.
Maybe it was a very clear presentation, I'm hoping. Maybe I can share just an unsolicited comment is that even in my short time at OSU so far, I've been really just delighted by the students, and they seem to be really interested in these concepts. And even to me, these are complex concepts, but they seem hungry to jump on these ideas of equity and interactions between infrastructure systems. So I will say a highlight for me has just been engaging with our students around these concepts.
If there are not further questions, I'll thank Professor Best again for sharing his really interesting perspectives and different approaches to the work she's doing to understand that infrastructure, human connection that is so important to the work of civil and environmental engineers. I will note that anybody who has attended and requested continuing professional development hours, we will get those certificates out to you within the next 2 weeks. This actually is our last of the 4 annual seminars that we present over the course of the academic year. Our timing does depend on the availability of those who volunteer to share their time and their ideas from among the faculty. So we're wrapping up a little bit early this year, but please stay tuned. And it's just been a pleasure to see the interest as we've continued to offer. I believe, Kevin, we're in our 3rd year now of this series, and bring some faculty that you have not heard from yet who are looking at other interesting topics that have relevance to practitioners and to policymakers when we resume again in September. And thank you to Kevin, who's the master behind all of this, that connects things and keeps it all going together,
Happy
and
to.
yeah, making sure that folks are connected and having credit from their certificates. So thank you again, Kelsey. Really glad that you could share some time with us today.
Thank you.